Some people left places like Macon, but many did not. And the question is not just why they stayed. The question is what staying meant. In a place shaped by everything you have just seen, because staying was not always a choice made freely. Sometimes it was a decision made inside limits, inside pressure, and inside a system that did not easily let people go. The land held memory, not always by choice, but by force. And then, slowly, by love, by claim, by the quiet insistence that this ground belonged to them too. To leave meant leaving the graves, leaving the names carved into wood and stone, leaving the only place on earth where your people had ever been known. But staying came at a cost. Debt cycles that never closed, owing more than you could ever earn, season after season, year after year. The ledger always tipped against you. This was not accident. This was architecture. The black codes had already drawn the walls. Sharecropping was just the lock on the door. And yet staying also meant belonging. It was the one place where a black man could stand at the front of a room and be heard, where a black woman could lead and be followed. Community was survival. To stay was to remain inside something that held you even when everything outside tried to break you. But we have to flip this. Unknown cities. Racism that wore different clothes but cut the same way. No family. No land. No church that knew your name. Survival was not guaranteed in the North. It was just a different kind of risk. Some who left never made it. Some who left came back. And some who stayed because they had already calculated the odds and decided that the devil they knew was survivable. There's a porch in this story. Not the warning kind. Not the voice that says, be careful, be small, be quiet. This is the porch of reflection, of someone who stayed and lived and is still here, watching the light change over land that holds everything they ever loved. Not defeat, not surrender. Just the weight of a life lived inside impossible choices carried with dignity. Some left. Some stayed. But both carried the weight. And the weight did not care which road you took. It came with you. It stayed with you. It was the price of being black in America, whether you moved or whether you remained. Remember them both.
Dignity matters because staying was never as simple as people make it sound. Some stayed because they had elders to care for. Some stayed because children needed feeding before dreams could be chased. Some stayed because a church, a graveyard, a family name, or a small piece of land held them in place. Some stayed because leaving took money, contacts, courage, and a plan, and not everybody had all four at the same time. In places like Macon, staying could look like acceptance from the outside, but from the inside, it could be strategy. It could be responsibility. It could be love. It could be the decision to hold together what had not yet been completely taken. That is why we have to be careful when we talk about people who remained. They were not simply passive. They were living inside hard limits and still trying to make a life. A woman might stay because her mother was buried there. A man might stay because the only work he knew was tied to that soil. A family might stay because the road out required more than hope. It required help, timing, and somebody waiting on the other side. Staying did not always mean surrender. Sometimes staying meant looking at the world as it was, counting the cost, and choosing the survival you could reach. It meant saying, I may not be free the way I deserve to be, but I am still here. I am still building. I am still carrying my people forward. That kind of choice deserves to be seen clearly, not judged from a distance. Because sometimes the strongest people were the ones who stayed and survived. Leaving was not simple either. For those who stepped away from places like Macon, the road out carried its own weight. People left with hope, but also with uncertainty. They left behind land they knew, people who knew them, and a way of life that, even with its limits, was familiar. What waited ahead was not always clear. Cities promised work and distance, but they also carried new forms of struggle. Crowded neighborhoods, limited jobs, and systems that still drew lines around where Black families could live and how far they could move. The journey itself could be difficult. Some left by train, some by bus, some by whatever means they could gather together. What they carried was often small: a suitcase, a few clothes, maybe a Bible, maybe photographs, maybe names and addresses written down carefully in case they needed to find someone once they arrived. But they also carried something heavier. They carried memory. They carried the lessons they had learned about how to survive, how to read a room, how to protect themselves and their families in a world that did not always welcome them. Reaching a new place did not mean starting from zero. It meant starting again with everything you had already lived through. Some found opportunity. Some found struggle. Most found both at the same time. That is what makes leaving as complex as staying. It was not an escape from history. It was a movement through it. People left Macon looking for something better, but they did not leave themselves behind. They carried their past into their future, shaping the next chapter. It meant carrying memory with you even when you were trying to start over. People did not leave places like Macon empty. They carried voices, habits, warnings, and ways of seeing the world that had been shaped long before they ever stepped onto a train. They carried the sound of porches at night, the rhythm of work in the fields, the way elders spoke carefully about what could and could not be said out loud. In a new place, those memories did not disappear. They showed up in how people moved, how they trusted, how they protected themselves. A man might lower his voice without thinking. A woman might watch a room before she felt safe in it. Parents taught their children lessons that had been passed down quietly. Lessons about survival, respect, and how to navigate a world that did not always show itself clearly. Even opportunity came with caution. New jobs, new streets, new neighbors did not erase what people already knew. It added to it. People learned to adjust, but they did not forget. They built new routines while holding on to old instincts. So when families left, they were not becoming someone new. They were building on top of everything they had already lived through. That is what makes this story larger than one town. The people who left carried Macon with them, shaping lives far beyond its borders, even when no one around them knew where they had come from or what they had already endured. It meant carrying memory into places that did not always welcome it, carrying names that had meaning back home but meant nothing in a new city, carrying lessons learned under pressure and trying to make them fit inside a world that played by different rules. For many, leaving Macon was not just movement, it was translation. Figuring out how to survive somewhere that did not know your story, did not know your people, and did not care what you had already endured just to arrive. Some found opportunity, some found distance from the weight they had been living under. But distance did not erase what had been built into them. The discipline, the caution, the understanding of how power worked, that came with them. And for those who stayed, that same understanding shaped a different kind of life. A life built on knowing the land, knowing the people, and knowing exactly where the lines were drawn. So whether they left or remained, people were not starting from zero. They were moving forward with everything that had shaped them. And that is what makes this story harder to simplify, because it was never just about escape, and it was never just about staying. It was about navigating a system that followed you one way or another. Boards creak beneath her chair, their edges rounded by decades of summer heat and bare feet. Dusk settles gentle over Macon, Mississippi, softening the lines of the old house. Mrs. Shara Triplett sits alone, her hands folded in her lap, eyes fixed on the worn path her late husband once walked. The lamplight glows behind her, casting golden warmth over photographs on the wall, faces of children who left for Chicago and Detroit, chasing work and hope. She remembers the night he left, suitcase in hand, promising to send for her and the boys. He wrote letters, sent money, but the land kept her rooted. Cotton fields needed tending, the youngest still in diapers, elders too frail to travel. She stayed, holding the family together, her strength quiet as the southern air. Now, as cicadas hum and a distant train whistles, Sarah recalls both sacrifice and pride. Some left, some stayed, all bound by memory and duty. The porch remains, a witness to choices shaped by love and necessity. In the stillness, her story lingers, not of escape, but of enduring. grounded in the soil and spirit of Black Southern life. The watermark from chains to change rests quietly in the corner, marking this moment in memory. What people were facing did not begin in the moment they chose to stay or leave. The rules had already been shaped. After slavery, systems were put in place to control movement, labor, and opportunity, even when freedom had been declared. Those patterns did not disappear. They followed people, changing form depending on where they were. So when families made decisions about staying in Macon or leaving for somewhere new, they were not choosing in a vacuum. They were responding to a world that had already been structured to limit how far freedom could really go. That is where this story stops being distant. Behind all of this, the land, the pressure, the decisions, there were real people trying to figure out what came next. My father was one of those people. He did not grow up reading about systems. He lived inside them. He made decisions early, not because he wanted to, but because he had to. Responsibility does not always wait until you are ready. Sometimes it shows up and you either step into it or you fall behind. Some lessons were passed down with love. Some were passed down with fear. Some were passed down through pain people did not yet have the language to name. In many Black families, harsh discipline was treated as protection. A child had to be corrected quickly, sharply, before the world outside corrected them with something worse. That is hard to talk about, but it belongs in this story. Because when people were forced to live inside danger for generations, danger shaped the way children were raised. Parents and grandparents were not only teaching manners, they were teaching survival. How to speak, how to stand, how not to draw the wrong attention, how to stay alive in a world that could punish Black children for being too loud, too bold, too free. So sometimes discipline became fear. Sometimes correction became pain. And sometimes the whipping inside the house looked too much like the violence our people had already survived outside it. That does not mean our people did not love their children. Many loved them deeply, but love under pressure can still carry wounds. The master system did not only control bodies in the field, it left habits behind. It taught people that pain could create obedience, and obedience could keep you alive. Generations later, some families were still carrying that lesson without fully knowing where it came from. This is one of the hardest parts of survival history. The damage did not always announce itself as damage. Sometimes it showed up as discipline, as "I'm doing this for your own good," as "I don't want the world to get you first." That kind of thinking did not come from nowhere. It came from a history where danger was real, where one mistake could cost more than a lesson, and where parents felt the weight of trying to prepare their children for a world that did not give second chances easily. But there is another truth sitting alongside that one. Not all of that discipline was protection. Some of it crossed into harm. Some of it went beyond what a child should have to carry. And even when it came from fear, even when it came from love, it could still leave wounds that followed people long after childhood was over. That is part of what survival looked like too. Not only strength, not only resilience, but pain that had nowhere to go at the time. Pain that was absorbed, carried forward and sometimes passed down before it was fully understood. And still, people found ways to break that pattern. Some made a different choice. Some decided that what they had lived through would not be repeated the same way. That is also part of this story. Not only what was carried, but what was changed. Because history is not only about what happened to us, it is also about what we decide to do with it. Comes into this story as part of that same search for a way forward. He was born in Macon in 1936, into a family already shaped by movement, responsibility, and hard decisions. Some of his brothers had already gone north to places like Chicago and Detroit, chasing factory work and the promise of something better. And they did find work. They found wages. They found a different kind of life than what Mississippi had offered. But what they found was not freedom without limits. Opportunity existed, but it came with boundaries. Where you could live was often decided for you. Neighborhoods were crowded, opportunities uneven, and the pressure of starting over in a new place did not disappear just because you had left the South. Families carried the weight of what they had come from while trying to adjust to what they had stepped into. And still, they kept going. Because this was not just about leaving, it was about building something, even inside limits. If you're still watching, take a moment to subscribe, like this video, and drop a note telling me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story is reaching. Because when we talk about migration, we are not just talking about movement. We are talking about families trying to create something better, one decision at a time. Over time, those pressures did not just stay on the outside. They began to show up inside the family. Not all at once, not in the same way for everyone, but slowly. Long hours, limited options. The strain of trying to hold everything together in a place that did not always make room for you. It could wear people down. And sometimes, what looked like strength from the outside was actually survival under pressure. Some struggled in ways that were harder to see. Some turned to things that helped them get through the day, even if those things came with a cost. Not because they did not care, not because they were weak, but because they were carrying more than most people ever had to explain. And still, families held on. Grandmothers like Sarah became anchors, the ones who kept names, kept stories, kept people connected when everything else felt like it was pulling apart. Even after leaving Mississippi, the responsibility did not disappear. In many ways, it followed them. So when we talk about what people found when they left, we have to tell the whole truth. There was opportunity, but there was also weight. And for many families, both lived side by side. Even the paths that were supposed to live families did not always lead where people thought they would. Men in my family served this country. My grandfather wore a uniform. My father did too. They stepped into a system that promised structure, opportunity, and a way forward beyond what places like Macon could offer. And in some ways, it did. But in other ways, it did not deliver equally. Because when they came home, the benefits that were supposed to help build a future were not always fully accessible to them. The same doors that opened wider for others did not always open the same way for Black families. So even after service, even after sacrifice, stability was not guaranteed. And that matters because it shaped what came next. Families still had to find a way to survive. Some found work. Some struggled to hold things together. And for some, the safety nets that were meant to help became part of everyday life, not as a failure, but as a reflection of a system that did not treat everyone the same. So when we tell this story, we have to widen the lens, because this was not just about leaving Mississippi. It was about navigating a country that changed depending on who you were, even after you had served it. Growing up in Chicago was not easy. I was the second oldest, but really, I became the oldest in responsibility. 6 siblings, a household that needed structure, needed help, needed someone to hold things together. And at the same time, I was trying to find a future. When it came time for high school, I applied to a Catholic school. I took the test. I passed. I did everything I was supposed to do. But I was told I couldn't attend. Not because I wasn't capable, but because we were on welfare. My mother stepped in and worked something out with the church. They agreed to help at first, and after that, I worked. I got a job at the Chicago Tribune after school, making calls, helping cover the cost of my education. I was 15 years old, and even then, I could see it clearly. If I stayed, my life would already be decided. I would be helping raise my siblings, waiting for time to pass, and hoping something changed. But I didn't want to wait. My father kept saying, "Learn to read, go to school." So I did. And eventually, I made the decision to leave. Not because I didn't love my family, but because I could not see a future for myself if I stayed. After everything, my father and I still had a strong connection. The last time I saw him, he came all the way to California. This was a man who didn't fly. He didn't travel like that. But somehow he made that trip. I sent him the money, got him to the airport, and when he landed, I was there to pick him up. We spent time together. Real time, the kind you don't realize is important until later. When it was time for him to go back to Chicago, it was emotional, because I didn't know how sick he really was, and he didn't want me to know. But what I did know was this. Before I ever left, I told my father I was going to do something different with my life, and he was the only one who stood in my corner. He told me, "Don't look back. Don't come back. You're doing the right thing." He gave me permission to move forward. And that matters because not everyone gets that. The rest of the family saw it differently. Some felt like I turned my back on them. And to this day, some of that feeling is still there. But my father saw something else. He saw a way out. He understood that sometimes love is not holding somebody close. Sometimes love is telling them to go before the same struggle swallows them too. He knew what Chicago had become for a lot of families like ours. Good people working hard, trying to survive, but carrying stress, addiction, poverty, violence, and disappointment year after year. Dreams got smaller. People got tired. Some never recovered from what they had already lived through down south before they even arrived there. My father had his own pain, but even through all of that, he never stopped pushing one thing into my mind. Learn to read, go to school, learn all you can. I still remember him studying for his GED. He wanted more for himself, even late in life. And when he looked at me, I think he hoped maybe one person in the family could break through the wall that had trapped so many of us for generations. That goodbye at the airport was not just a goodbye between a father and daughter. It was one generation praying the next one might finally get free. For a long time, I carried his words without fully understanding them. Don't look back, don't come back. At first, it sounded like distance, like separation, like I was being told to leave something behind. But over time, I began to hear something else in it. It was not about turning my back on my family. It was about not letting the same conditions pull me back into a life I could already see unfolding in front of me. My father knew what staying could mean. He had lived it. He had watched people try, struggle, fall, and sometimes never get back up. So when he told me to go, he was not pushing me away. He was trying to protect my future. That changed how I saw everything. Leaving was no longer just a choice. It became a responsibility, not only to myself, but to everything that had come before me. All the sacrifices, all the pain, all the lessons carried forward. In that moment, I was not just leaving a place. I was stepping into something my father believed I could become, even when I was not sure yet. The truth is, my story is not unique. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. Because for every person who left a place like Macon, there was a reason. And for every person who stayed, there was a reason too. Neither one was simple. Neither one was easy. People were making decisions inside systems they did not create, but had to survive anyway. Some carried those choices into cities like Chicago and Detroit. Some carried them on the same land their families had already given everything to. But either way, the weight came with them. And maybe that's the part we don't talk about enough. Not just where people went, but what they had to carry to get there. If you're still watching, I want you to think about your own story. What was carried into your life that you didn't choose? What did someone before you survive so you could stand where you are now? And if this story meant something to you, if it made you think, remember, or feel something, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're watching from. Because stories like this don't just belong to one family. They belong to all of us, and they deserve to be remembered.